In June 1967, Israel did not wait to be attacked. It struck first. Before any Arab army crossed a border. Before a single Israeli city was bombed. Before the world could agree that a war had even begun. Within hours, enemy air forces were crippled on the ground. Within days, the balance of power in the Middle East was rewritten. And yet, this victory created a question that still has no safe answer. When does striking first become self-defense? Who decides that a threat is imminent enough to justify war? And what happens when survival depends on acting before certainty exists? Because this was not just a military operation. It was a strategic gamble built on incomplete intelligence, moral ambiguity, and a single, fragile assumption. That waiting would be more dangerous than attacking. In this documentary, we will not ask how Israel won. We will ask why it chose a move that should not have existed. And what it cost to make that choice. Israel's dilemma was not tactical. It was existential. A small state, narrow borders, limited manpower, and no strategic depth. Surrounded by adversaries whose combined forces vastly exceeded its own. Every day of mobilization drained the economy. Every delay favored the side with numbers. The conventional doctrine was clear. Do not fire the first shot. Preserve political legitimacy. Force the enemy to reveal intent. But doctrine assumes time. And time was the one resource Israel did not have. Intelligence pointed to mounting pressure. Troop movements. Rhetoric escalating. Signals that suggested conflict, but stopped short of certainty. This created a paradox no textbook solves. If Israel waited and was attacked, survival was at risk. If Israel attacked first, legitimacy was at risk. Either way, the margin for error was fatal. This is why the strategy that emerged was not merely aggressive. It was structurally abnormal. It placed preemption, not deterrence, at the center of national security. It accepted political and moral risk as the price of survival. And it assumed that acting on uncertainty was safer than waiting for proof. Israel did not face one opponent. It faced a system. A system made of neighboring states with overlapping interests, shared hostility, and asymmetric tolerance for loss. Egypt, Syria, Jordan, different doctrines, different command cultures, but aligned by one expectation, that Israel could be worn down, contained, or forced into a defensive posture where numbers would eventually matter. Israel's objective, by contrast, was brutally simple. Avoid a prolonged war. Not because prolonged war was undesirable, but because it was unsustainable. Israel's population base was small. Its reserve system required rapid mobilization that paralyzed civilian life. Every additional day of full readiness drained the economy, strained logistics, and eroded political cohesion. Time did not favor Israel. Time favored everyone else. Geography reinforced this imbalance. Israel had no strategic depth. Key population centers sat minutes from front lines. Airbases, command hubs, and transportation arteries were clustered and exposed. A successful first strike by the opposing coalition, even a partial one, would not need to be decisive. It would only need to be disruptive. That was the baseline risk. On the other side, Arab forces faced their own constraints. Coalition warfare slowed decision-making. Command chains were rigid. Air forces were large but unevenly trained. Defensive postures relied heavily on centralized control and predictable routines. This created an illusion of strength. Numerical superiority suggested dominance. But numerical superiority also required coordination. And coordination created friction. Israel's intelligence apparatus observed this friction closely. Not as an opportunity, but as a countdown. Mobilization on all sides increased pressure. Diplomacy stalled. Signals multiplied but remained ambiguous. No single move confirmed intent. No single order crossed a legal threshold. And that was the most dangerous condition of all. Because strategy does not fail only when information is wrong. It fails when information is incomplete, and action must still be taken. Israel's leadership faced a narrowing corridor of options. Wait longer, and risk losing the initiative permanently. Act early, and risk becoming the author of the war. Neither path offered safety. Only different kinds of exposure. Military doctrine is designed to reduce uncertainty. It favors clarity, confirmation, and restraint. In Israel's case, the correct path was obvious. Hold fire. Complete mobilization. Harden defenses. Force the opposing coalition to make the first move. This approach carried political advantages. International legitimacy would be preserved. Allies would be reassured. Any escalation could be framed as unavoidable. For most states, this logic is sound. For Israel, it was lethal. A defensive posture required time. And time was not neutral. Every hour of full mobilization froze the economy. Factories stopped. Civilian infrastructure strained. Public anxiety rose. The longer Israel waited, the more pressure accumulated internally. But the deeper problem was operational. A defensive strategy assumed that Israel could absorb the opening blow. That assumption was false. Israel's airbases were vulnerable. Its command network was compact. Its margin for disruption was thin. If the opposing coalition struck first, even imperfectly, Israel would be forced into reactive operations under degraded conditions. Air superiority would become contested. Mobilization would turn chaotic. Decision-making would slow precisely when speed mattered most. Doctrine also assumed that deterrence would hold. That the threat of Israeli retaliation would delay or prevent attack. But deterrence depends on shared risk tolerance. And Israel's adversaries did not share Israel's vulnerability profile. They could lose more and still fight. Israel could not. This asymmetry broke the textbook. The safe option required Israel to accept the highest downside risk. The restrained option assumed survivability that did not exist. This created a contradiction no doctrine resolved. To preserve legitimacy, Israel had to wait. To preserve survival, Israel had to act. At this point, the problem ceased to be military. It became structural. The question was no longer how to fight. It was whether the rules governing the decision still applied. And once that question was asked, the traditional framework collapsed. The idea of striking first did not emerge as a bold stroke. It emerged as a reluctant conclusion. Inside Israel's decision-making circle, there was no illusion of certainty. Intelligence assessments were fragmentary. Signals contradicted each other. Every briefing ended with the same unresolved phrase, likely, but not proven. This ambiguity fractured the room. Some argued that without unmistakable proof, preemption would destroy Israel's legitimacy. They feared diplomatic isolation more than military surprise. They warned that history punishes those who fire the first shot. Others focused on a different risk. They argued that waiting for proof meant waiting for damage. That the first enemy move would not need to be decisive, only disruptive. That once Israel lost air superiority, recovery would be slow, costly, and uncertain. What unified both camps was an uncomfortable recognition. There was no correct answer left. At the center of the debate sat a small set of assumptions. The first assumption was operational. That Israel could achieve overwhelming effect quickly enough to prevent escalation from spreading. The second assumption was psychological. That the opposing command systems would hesitate, misinterpret, or fragment under sudden pressure. The third assumption was political. That international backlash would be survivable. And temporary. None of these assumptions were guaranteed. Each one could collapse independently. But taken together, they formed a narrow logic. If all three held, Israel would shorten the war dramatically. If even one failed, the consequences would be severe. This was not a plan built on confidence. It was built on comparative risk. Waiting offered fewer variables, but worse outcomes. Acting introduced more variables, but the possibility of control. The final shift occurred when leaders stopped asking, "Is this justified?" and started asking, "Which mistake is irreversible?" Because a diplomatic crisis could be managed. A military collapse could not. The decision to preempt was therefore not framed as aggression. It was framed as damage control under existential constraint. A move designed not to win glory, but to avoid a scenario from which recovery was impossible. On paper, preemption looked clean. In reality, it was a logistical stress test with no tolerance for error. Israel's plan did not rely on superior numbers. It relied on tempo. Specifically, on the ability to generate, recover, rearm, and relaunch aircraft at a pace the opposing system could not match, or even comprehend. This required an abnormal operational rhythm. Ground crews trained for years to compress turnaround times to the edge of human endurance. Maintenance protocols were stripped to essentials. Every unnecessary step was removed. Every delay was treated as existential. The Air Force was not just a striking arm. It was the spine of the strategy. If air superiority was not achieved immediately, the logic of preemption collapsed. There was no fallback posture. No gradual escalation path. That was the first fracture point. The second fracture point was synchronization. The initial wave had to arrive when enemy aircraft were most vulnerable. Parked, refueling, crew dispersed, defenses relaxed. This window was narrow. Measured in minutes, not hours. A mistimed launch. A navigation error. Unexpected weather. Any deviation would reduce surprise and trigger defensive dispersion. Once that happened, the cost curve inverted. Israel's small fleet would be forced into contested airspace. Attrition would rise. Sortie generation would slow. The initiative would evaporate. The third fracture point was information control. The plan assumed that the first hours would be dominated by confusion. That enemy command would misinterpret the scale and intent of the attack. That reports would be delayed, fragmented, contradictory. But confusion is unstable. The moment clarity emerged, the strategic window closed. Air defenses would activate. Aircraft would be dispersed. Political leadership would shift from disbelief to retaliation. This placed extreme pressure on sequencing. The first wave did not merely need to succeed. It needed to succeed fast enough to make the second and third waves survivable. Failure did not mean defeat at the front line. It meant systemic collapse. And this is where the mythology often hides the risk. There was no redundancy built into the concept. Redundancy would slow the tempo. Slower tempo would defeat the purpose. The strategy traded resilience for speed. It accepted brittleness as a cost. If the system held, the payoff would be decisive. If it cracked, recovery would be impossible. This is the hidden reality of preemptive doctrine. It does not forgive partial success. It does not reward adaptation mid-course. It either overwhelms or it implodes. The first reports were incomplete. Airfields were hit, but the scale was unclear. Communications were disrupted, but not entirely severed. Radar data conflicted with eyewitness accounts. This was not yet perceived as a decisive strike. It was perceived as an incident. Command systems are trained to categorize events. Small attack. Large attack. Provocation. Prelude. The problem was that this attack did not fit cleanly into any category. It was too coordinated to be a raid. Too limited, at first glance, to be total war. Too early to match expected timelines. As a result, the initial response defaulted to caution. Commanders waited for confirmation. Headquarters requested clarification. Political leadership hesitated to authorize full-scale retaliation without understanding scope and intent. This hesitation was not incompetence. It was institutional logic. Coalition command structures are designed to prevent overreaction. They prioritize control, verification, and hierarchical authorization. In normal conditions, this prevents disaster. Under preemptive shock, it creates delay. Air forces that could have dispersed remained grounded. Defensive measures that required coordination stalled. Local commanders deferred action upward, expecting guidance that arrived too late. Doctrine amplified the problem. Training emphasized responding to escalation after clear hostile intent. It did not prepare commanders for a situation where the enemy acted before intent was formally established. This created a psychological lag. The attack was interpreted through familiar frameworks. Border clashes, limited strikes, signaling operations. By the time it was understood as systemic, the system itself was already compromised. The critical failure was not a single wrong decision. It was a sequence of reasonable decisions made under a false premise. That premise was simple: that Israel would not risk political isolation by striking first at full scale. This assumption shaped expectations. Expectations shaped interpretation. Interpretation shaped response. Once the assumption collapsed, it was too late to rebuild the response architecture. The outcome was not sealed by superior force alone. It was sealed by a mismatch between reality and belief. Preemption worked not because it destroyed everything, but because it destroyed the enemy's ability to decide correctly in time. The immediate outcome was unambiguous. Israel achieved operational dominance faster than even its planners expected. The opposing coalition lost the initiative before it could reorganize. The war ended quickly, decisively, and on terms favorable to Israel. From a narrow military perspective, the strategy worked. But strategy is not judged only by what it delivers. It is judged by what it creates next. The first price was political. By striking first, Israel permanently altered how its actions would be interpreted. Every future use of force would be viewed through the lens of precedent. Defensive logic would be met with skepticism. Preemption would be assumed, not debated. International legitimacy was not lost. But it became conditional, fragile, and contested. The second price was strategic. Success validated a doctrine that cannot tolerate routine use. Preemption works only when it is rare. When it shocks expectations. When it exploits assumptions that have not yet adapted. By proving it could be done, Israel ensured that adversaries would evolve around it. Dispersal. Hardening. Redundancy. Embedding military assets among civilian infrastructure. Each future threat would be harder to neutralize cleanly. Each future decision would carry higher humanitarian and political cost. The third price was psychological and internal. The leadership that authorized the strike did not gain certainty. They gained responsibility. Responsibility for a decision that could never be fully justified by evidence. Only by outcome. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. When success retroactively legitimizes risk, future leaders may mistake fortune for principle. The most sobering question is not what happened, but what would have happened if a single assumption failed? If weather had disrupted timing? If intelligence misread dispersal patterns? If the opponent reacted faster? Failure would not have meant stalemate. It would have meant national trauma. This is the paradox of preemptive strategy. It produces clean victories only when everything goes right, and existential disasters when anything goes wrong. At its core, this strategy was not about aggression. And it was not about confidence. It was about managing fear under asymmetric constraints. Israel's decision to strike first did not emerge from superiority. It emerged from vulnerability. A state with depth can trade space for time. A state without depth must trade legitimacy for initiative. That is the first principle this doctrine reveals. Preemption becomes attractive only when delay is more dangerous than escalation. Not because war is desired, but because waiting removes the last remaining variable a vulnerable state can control. The second principle is more uncomfortable. This strategy works only when uncertainty is accepted as permanent. Israel did not act because it knew. It acted because it believed that knowledge would arrive too late to matter. This runs directly against the logic of modern governance. States are expected to justify violence with evidence. Preemptive doctrine accepts that evidence may never be complete. That gap is where the moral risk lives. The third principle is structural, not ethical. Preemption is not a reusable tool. It degrades with exposure. The moment a strategy becomes predictable, it stops being effective. The moment adversaries plan around it, its costs rise exponentially. What worked in 1967 does not scale forward cleanly. Each repetition demands greater certainty, greater secrecy, greater speed, and pays diminishing returns. This is why most military systems reject preemption as doctrine. Not because it is immoral, but because it is brittle. It demands perfection from humans operating under stress. It compresses decision windows to the point where error becomes catastrophic. And it replaces reversible mistakes with irreversible ones. The final insight is the hardest to accept. This strategy does not tell us how to win wars. It tells us how wars begin when survival and legitimacy collide. And in that collision, there are no clean choices. Only choices that fail differently. Because when a state decides that waiting is more dangerous than acting, the war has already started, even if no one else knows it yet. Israel's preemptive strike did not rewrite military theory. It exposed its limits. It showed that doctrine collapses fastest where vulnerability is greatest. That legality strains under existential pressure. And that the most dangerous decisions are often made before the world agrees a decision exists at all. This was not a story about boldness. It was a story about constraint. A reminder that some strategies are born not from ambition, but from the absence of acceptable alternatives. And that when survival depends on acting without certainty, history will always argue about intent, long after the consequences are irreversible.